So, we're going to begin our discussion and our foray into the deeper topics of missiology, first by discussing paradigms. Paradigm, this is a word that you hear thrown around a lot and it's utilized a lot, but I think it's important for us to have a firm grasp because we're going to be focusing on what are the various phases, the various paradigms that missiology has gone through. And probably in your mind, you're thinking, isn't missions just where we go share the gospel? Isn't missions where we just go plant a church? Isn't missions where we cross over the ocean and go somewhere else? And so we've had that discussion in the previous module about what is mission, and I think we answered that there. But we have to think through how does one's paradigm influence how one sees the Bible, how one sees interpretation, how one sees mission. And so let's first start with that word paradigm and make sure that we're all on the same page. So just a textbook definition of paradigm is a philosophical and theoretical framework of a scientific school or discipline within which theories, laws, and generalizations and the experiments performed in support of them are formulated. And so it's a framework. A paradigm is a kind of mental map, if you will. This is very comparable to our definition of culture from Paul Hebert. And so it's a mental map, it's a framework. It sets the boundaries for a discussion. What counts as valid? What counts as proof? What counts as information? Within which is a framework in which theories, laws, and generalizations. So not everything within a paradigm is firm, is 100%. So if you've taken a theology course, which I assume you have at this point in your academic career, you will notice that there are schools of thought. You have covenantal theology, you have dispensational theology, you have reformed theology, and all of these fit within a framework. And whatever your paradigm or your set of references for understanding theology, you will look at another set of theology and you will judge it based on your paradigm. Now, we're quick to look at someone else's paradigm and point to, well, here's where you formed a generalization and the data doesn't fit your model. Sometimes we're even frustrated when we find we have that kind of aha moment of, look, here's this one piece of data that doesn't fit into your overarching paradigm. Sometimes we do this from one faith to another, from one denomination to another, where we go, aha, we've got this one bit of information. And so within the definition of a paradigm is the idea that there are generalizations, and we're going to discuss later why are these generalizations so important, how are they challenged, why does counterfacts not seem to immediately destroy an existing paradigm. But without a paradigm, it would be hard for us to formulate any greater theory about a particular topic or discipline. It's just such an important element to kind of have a map, a framework for integrating one piece of information with the next. Just like in a math equation, 2 plus 2 equals 4. But if we don't have a set frame of reference for what is 2 and what is 4, these are just meaningless terms. We could say an apple and an apple is a banana, and it's equally logical if we don't have a paradigm which would determine how are each of these references understood. And so that's the basis of a paradigm. Now, as we think of looking at missiology and incorporating with it not just the ology side of it, the study of, or the theology side of it, but also the history and the paradigm element, there are a number of ways of dividing history. So we're talking about going from the time of Christ up until this very second, and honestly into the future. So some of you students, you might live through more than one paradigm of missiology. We are in a current paradigm that is in a dramatic shift. And so it's an exciting time to be in missions, to be honest, is because of these shifts that are taking place. Kenneth Scott Latourette, he's got a multi-part series it's a 6-part series called Mission, A History of the Expansion of Christianity. So he was a missionary and he's a church historian. And in his 6-volume work, he divides things into 5 different paradigms. Now, he is dealing predominantly historically with missiology. And so he's not dealing as much, as we'll see the next person I'm going to reference, he's not dealing as much with kind of the more intellectual or the framework as he is just grouping things by chronology. And so he groups things into the first 5 centuries. So you think of the early church expansion from the time of the apostles through 500. Then he has the 1,000 years of uncertainty from 500 to 1500. So following through the Roman Empire, through its collapse, through barbarian invasions, and what is going to become of Christianity. And in missions history, there is a brief moment where it seemed like, at least on the Western front, that it might just all end, and that be it. And so Latourette calls this the years of uncertainty. From 1500 to 1800, he calls it 3 centuries of advance. And so you'll notice these years relate to a time of conquest for the church, for Western countries. And this conquest sometimes involved even crusades and fighting. It involved global exploration, but it ends coming up on a time that we would call the colonial era. And this becomes a huge time period, not just for missiology and theology, but even politically. And so many things that we're seeing in the world today, that we're seeing in Africa and Latin America and Asia, is what we would call post-colonialism or anti-colonialism even. And there's a strong sentiment of national pride, as many countries have won back their independence. And we'll talk about this later when we get into this specific paradigm. But as many countries have won back independence from colonial powers, there's this strong push away from anything that is from the outside, from anything that is foreign, from anything that is Western. And so these centuries have set up this time period. And then his final period is advance through the storm. And so he starts with 1914, which is just after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And he says onward. Now the book is published in 1945. So he publishes this the year that World War II has started. So this does also really date this series, which for our purposes, we definitely, if we were going to use his model, we definitely need to add some extra time periods to include, present time. But this is just one way. Whichever model we use, we're in the time where the world is in a rapid state of change. That's our time period. So whether we use Latourette, I'm about to talk about Hans Kung, if we use his model, we today, you watching this video, taking this class, you and I find ourselves in a period of rapid flux and change. And so each of those time periods in Latourette's model represent significant numbers of years. And for us, we're on the cusp of technological breakthrough, political breakthrough, social breakthrough. There's mass migration movements. All of this stuff is happening right now in our generation. And so we're in this time where there is much less certainty. During the colonial era, 3 men in Europe could control a significant portion of the world's surface. And today, obviously, any three men or any 300 men in the Western world can't control that much as more. And this is not a bad thing, but this is certainly a new day and a new time to think about how are we going to do this task. So Hans Kung is the next person I want to talk about, and he has more of a paradigm-based theory. This is more ideological. So he's a Swiss priest, and he's also a Catholic theologian, and he wrote a book called Paradigm Change in Theology. And he's speaking broadly in this book more of Christianity, but a very important character. His name is David Bosch. He's written a book called Paradigms in Missiology, and Transforming Mission, subtitled Paradigms in Missiology. And you will see me interacting very strongly with Bosch's work. And so I'm indebted. Everyone is indebted to Bosch for a number of things. But if you read Bosch, you're going to find very strong evangelical things and very strong non-evangelical things. And so you'll find me leaning on him for some things and reacting against him. But his book is one of those that's so transformational that you can't talk about missions and not talk about his book. It just doesn't work. So he brings to bear Hans Kung's paradigm theory, not just as a theological categorization, but also as a missiological one. And so he puts things into 6 time periods, 6 paradigms. And this is actually the set of paradigms that we are going to use as we continue the lecture series going through the class. So the first one is the apocalyptic paradigm, and he's describing here early Christianity. Second is Hellenistic paradigm. This is the patristic period. Third would be the Roman Catholic paradigm that you see come about during the medieval period. The Reformation paradigm, obviously from the Reformation period. The Enlightenment paradigm, and the ecumenical paradigm. This ecumenical paradigm I'm going to call the postmodern paradigm, because I think that's when we start seeing postmodernism really taking root both culturally and theologically and socially even. But I think we need one more paradigm. And so I am adding to this list a globalization paradigm. Now, this globalization paradigm is kind of two paradigms that I'm, for the sake of how our course is designed, I'm collapsing into one paradigm, calling it the globalization paradigm. But that is diaspora and global theology. And so many of these books hint at different, this coming age of globalization and what that would mean for the church. But they didn't fully lean into global theology in the way that I'm going to in that paradigm. And so very quickly, the diaspora and global theology paradigms, these have come about because the church is no longer predominantly a Western institution in terms of where it is weighted geographically. So if you think of Christianity starting in Israel, starting in the Middle East, heading north and west into Europe, and then obviously the United States and the Western world, the far Western world, has been a very strong center in terms of books and publishing and seminaries and churches and missions dollars and sending agencies and all of these things. We are definitely in a strong center, but the church in Africa has expanded, and we'll talk about this again when we get more to that section. But the church in Africa has expanded exponentially. It has grown. In Asia as well. And so there's a need for them to, what Paul Hebert calls, self-theologize. And we are going to, again, we're going to unpack all of these terms. But as they begin theologizing, they are starting from a different paradigm altogether. So with both lists of paradigms, whether it's Latourette historical view or whether it's Kung's more rationalistic paradigm view, these are very Western ways of seeing the transformation. This is following the church in the West. But the church in Africa is much older than the church in the West. Africa has almost 2,000 years of church history. And so a time before the gospel ever made it to England, the church had been in Africa for several centuries already. And so modern scholars, and particularly as they're more global South scholars, becoming writers and seminary professors and pastors and having more impact, this is becoming something that we need to reckon with. The second part of that two-part paradigm is diaspora. And so when we think of diaspora, we think of dispersion, we think of people being sent out of their home country. And so now in today's world, there's about 214 million people that live outside their home country. And what is the church going to do? How are we going to respond missiologically? This is actually, for me personally, this is where my background is as a researcher, is what I've written my doctorate in. And I think both of these paradigms really speak to the globalized world that we live in. And so there are people from everywhere living everywhere now. What are we going to do? What does this mean? What are the implications for the church, for the gospel, and for mission? And so I'm going to add the globalization paradigm. Now, I'd like to point out that in our textbook, in Van Reenen, when you get there, he has a chapter where he talks about different epochs of mission history. And he actually summarizes Bosch. He adds to it Wall's and Winter's view on how it is. And honestly, a lot of these follow very, very similar time periods, and some of it's just an update in maybe nomenclature. I do like how Van Reenen closes out his. So he talks about the time of colonial expansion as kind of being his second to last paradigm. And then he talks about the time of globally embracing missiology and mission. And I think he makes a good point in that in today's world there is a much stronger sense of being more globally embracing. Probably where I would have a bit of a question in terms of how he defines that. Is if you see the voices that he uses voices like Bosch, which again we're going to use a lot, and he uses people like Paul Hebert, who's a fantastic Christian anthropologist, missionary, missiologist, and but the issue is these are not global leaders. Their missiology leads them to think globally about mission and to begin to argue for the need for the global church to be able to self-theologize. But they themselves are not global people. They are still very Western. And so I want you to think for a brief moment and answer this question. Pause the video at the end of the question and write your answer down, because this is important to think through. What are some of the factors that lead people to interpret things differently? Why is it that if we find ourselves in one time period, we would look at the same event and we would think about it very, very differently? What are those social factors that lead to that? So think of maybe seeing a man slap a woman in the street. Okay? That probably struck a chord with some of you. There's maybe a visceral response from us as we think about witnessing that event. Now, we have that visceral reaction based on a lot of factors. What are those factors? If we had different factors, how would we see that event? Same event, but just seen from a different paradigm. So pause the video for a moment and write down some of your answers. What are some of the factors that you wrote down? What are the categories that you included? Did you think of denominational tradition? Maybe you thought of historic context, personal context. Maybe people would see issues like that example. That might be a bit of an extreme example, or other examples you might see differently based on sex, age, marital status, education. What about social position? How high up are you in a particular society, or how low are you in a particular society? How does that influence how you interpret a particular event? Personality type, just kind of your psychological makeup. And what about culture, your worldview, and your language? How do all of these things impact you differently? And so obviously that kind of over-the-top example that I gave you is not completely unthinkable. That thing happens in America all the time. It happens in other countries all the time. And how we view that is based on many, many factors. And in some countries, a man beating his wife is not considered a bad thing. In fact, that's considered an expected thing by both men and women. There's no question of is it right. I lived and worked in the Middle East for a while, and there was an article about medical professionals' view of domestic violence. So we're not talking about street-level view, what does the everyman say? We're talking about what do medical professionals think. And the researchers were appalled to find how approving and how non-contradictory, non-contrarian the doctors and the nurses were who were tasked with taking care of these women who'd been beaten. Oftentimes they would ask questions like, well, was it your fault? Were you giving your husband a hard time? Were you being, lack of submission? So they started trying to tie it to all these root causes of, well, maybe don't do this next time, rather than saying, no, this is wrong. So they see that issue radically different than how I see it and how you see it, based on a different religious context, a different upbringing, a different time and space in this world. And I'm not saying that this issue now becomes relative because they have this different frame of reference. But if we don't understand how one's paradigm impacts what we do, we are going to grossly misunderstand many, many, many things in life. We're not going to be able to communicate from my point of reference to yours. Within this country and within individual churches, we see this manifest itself in terms of a war between generations, with older generations and younger generations being completely out of sync. And sometimes we make it all about age. But the reality is age, it relates to it in a sense, in that our age places us within a paradigm, but the reality is it's a difference in paradigms in how we see things like confrontation, communication, experience, emotion, truth. All of these things become not necessarily negated by one paradigm, but just given different places, given different orders. If you think of a telescope having multiple lenses, someone who's in an older generation might put those various topics in a particular order, whereas someone who's in a younger generation might reverse that order. Even having the same lenses, they put them in a different order, and it brings different things into focus. And the whole generational misunderstanding, cross-generational misunderstanding that we see so often in churches and outside of churches for that matter, is rooted in differences in paradigms. And sometimes our inability to communicate with the other is rooted in the fact that we don't operate from the same paradigm. So I want to talk for a moment about culture and paradigm change, because inevitably, if you're involved in some kind of mission activity, you're not only operating in your paradigm, and you're not merely trying to understand their paradigm, but there's also some sense where one or both of our paradigms are changing in some way. And so Anthony Wallace, he writes in an article in American Anthropologist called Revitalization Movements. He writes that a revitalization movement is one way for people to see change within a given paradigm. He says a culture and paradigm change or revitalization movement comes through deliberate, conscious, organized efforts by members of society to create a more satisfying culture. Now, he is part of a school of thought called functionalism, and functionalism tends to reduce everything to its kind of intended purpose, its function, its efficiency. And so it would look at something like religion and say, well, religion serves the function of meeting our felt needs, our felt need for belonging, our felt need for safety, for explaining things. And so religion may not be in any way, shape, or form some kind of absolute truth. It could be completely a human, agreed upon convention that gives a bigger meaning to our world and to reality. And so they would see many things like this as just a reaction, a response to psychological or physical felt needs. So he sees 5 stages of revitalization. And the first stage is a steady stage. This is where there's no sense of change whatsoever. So a culture or a paradigm is headed in this direction, and there's a degree of stasis. At some point, it moves to phase 2, which is a period of increased stress. Maybe you have this sense, if technology came into your home, there might be a generational dispute with you and your parents, maybe when you were growing up. And new technology often brings in stress to people who are not used to this. And so there's this increased stress, which kind of puts, almost like you're lifting a lever that's kind of rusted in one position, and you're giving it a tug, but it hasn't budged yet. So step 1 is everything's just floating along. Step 2 is there's some outside pressure or force that's putting us in a bind, and so we're forced to change. Step 3 is a period of cultural distortion. This is where the effect of the lever being pulled is in full effect. So if we think through the cause of the Jewish diaspora, this is the quintessential diaspora, and even secular sociologists, by the way, are using this term diaspora and the Old Testament Jewish diaspora as kind of their first test case for this subject. So if we look to that, and you think through some of the writings from Jeremiah, where there were false prophets speaking to the people saying, hey, the exile is not going to last very long. And Jeremiah writes his letter, which says, no, they've spoken without God's approval. The exile is going to last. Unpack your bags, get ready, it's going to be a while. But they went through a period of stress as invaders came in. They went through a period of crisis as they were defeated and handed over to their enemies. And things were just obliterated as they're watching their homeland in the rearview mirror. And so paradigm change had to happen. They were not in Kansas anymore. They had to learn, how do we adapt to being God's people in a pagan land? And a number of changes came through this time period. And so after this cultural distortion comes a period of revitalization. We can see that happening there. The same thing happened in the Roman Empire as outsiders began to invade and began to press in, you saw people asking the question, why is this happening? And there was a revivalist movement amongst the Romans, which directly hampered the early Christians because those people thought, well, don't you remember the good old glory days when we worshiped the Roman gods, and now we have all these Christ followers that are changing things up. Maybe there's a connection between this and the fact that we're not so strong. The same thing has happened with both Islam and Hinduism in their home contexts, as outside secularizing forces put pressure on it, and it went through a time of distortion and disruption, came revival movements. And so the Islamic revival movement and the Hindu revival movement have both come about as a response to westernization, to secularization, to modernization in their countries. And so after there's this period of revitalization, you reach a new stasis, you reach a new steady state, and that's his final step. But this isn't the only way, and this isn't the only theory to see how do paradigms change. Thomas Kuhn has written a very famous and slightly controversial book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He is a science historian, and so he writes about the history of science and how sometimes the information hasn't changed to the same degree that the paradigm has changed. And oftentimes, the paradigms can change and not be any more accurate to the absolute truth, even though they might be more true than the prior paradigm. Let me illustrate. There's a gentleman named Ignaz Semmelweis. Chances are you probably haven't heard of him. He is an Austrian-Hungarian doctor, and he discovered that there was a connection between unwashed hands and the rate at which women who were in labor or had just given birth would carry disease and would often die from disease, or their babies would get sick and die from disease. He was largely rejected, and he would write wildly accusing, even using words like murder to speak of the disregard that these other doctors had for what he saw as clear facts, what we today know are clear facts. So he was absolutely correct. He died in an insane asylum. His wife was even the one who helped put him there. But he died in an insane asylum because people were not ready for his change. And so Kuhn's theory is that there are many facts which will present themselves to a prior theory, to an older theory, which are in fact true facts or truer facts, or more true facts rather. And they will present themselves to this former paradigm, but if there's not a new, better, and more overarching paradigm, then whoever the people are holding up these new facts get laughed out of, get run out on a rail. They get laughed out of town until there's a new, better, stronger paradigm. Because the last thing people want to look like is like they're stupid or like they don't have some large framework for making generalizations and assumptions and understanding. These paradigms provide meaning. You're attacking our meaning without giving us a new way of interpreting meaning. Now, there's another gentleman who came along after him named Louis Pasteur. Most of you probably have heard of him. He offered the germ theory. This put language to Semmelweis's assertions or observations of fact. And so with this new theory, obviously now today, doctors are washing their hands with extreme diligence. And the theory took root.